Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 4101, talking about John Mandeville and his broad-mindedness. So we have an illustration here of the encounter between an emissary sent by Alexander the Great to the philosopher king Didymus, who's there to tell Alexander that although Alexander controls the world, is enormously powerful. In fact, he's not all that because he's driven by his desires and is too attached to this world. These are arguments that should be very familiar to you because you've encountered them in Boethius, you've encountered them in Philo, you've encountered them in Edmund Philo, and once again, you encounter them now here in the book of John Mandeville. This is an illustration that comes from a different manuscript, one that's just a record of the adventures of Alexander the Great. But because it's not very frequently illustrated, I want to include this picture. But I'm going to be talking today about some of the strange stuff in Mandeville, some of it that we didn't get to, and just give you a sense of how unusual he is as a thinker for a medieval work. So we have here an image from a 17th century printing of the Book of John Mandeville. It's something that I think I've said to you was read continuously from its first being produced in the 14th century, really through to the late 18th century. It's read continuously by people who aren't scholars, just regular people. They read it because they think it's interesting and it tells us some interesting things about the rest of the world. And it's really not until the 19th century that scholars like me start to get a hold of it and make it a little more easy to study, but maybe a little less exciting in certain ways. So here's an image of something you now know what this is. This is a Cynocephalus, so it's a human shaped from the neck down, dog shaped from the neck up, worshiping a golden calf. And then we have this abridgment here in 17th century English. And here we have a translation here from by Ian Higgins from the French original. And it says, and the men and the women of this island have dogs' heads, and they're called canopholis. That's the French for Cynocephali. And they are people possessed of reason and good understanding, and they worship an ox for their god. Thus each of them wears on his forehead a gold or silver ox as a sign that they do indeed love their god. And it says down here, if they take anyone in battle, they eat him. And the king of this island is very rich and very powerful and very devout according to his law. So we know several things. They're very religious, although they worship an idol. Of course, they have dogs' heads, that they wear clothing. We're told that here. And they are mighty warriors. They eat their enemies, so they sort of act like dogs in that regard. But we're also told they're reasonable. And Mandeville doesn't seem to be super worried about how to prove that. So this is not the work of Bertrams of Corbie, who's trying to figure out whether or not Cynocephali have immortal souls that are rational and therefore need to be the object of missionary attention. Mandeville is just here to kind of multiply the possibilities of the world and give us more stuff than we thought is possible. So that's his portrait of the Cynocephali. So we can talk more about that in class, even though you didn't read this passage for tomorrow. Now you have it in front of you. So something similar, another passage that I didn't assign, but one that I think is very, very exciting. Here we have an illustration from a Mandeville manuscript that's from the 14th and 15th century. And it is an image from basically Tibet. It's called Riboth in Mandeville. And it's something that is practiced by Tibetan Buddhists even now, called sky burial, where instead of burying the dead, some of them will expose their dead on a mountain plain in the Himalayas and wait for vultures to come down and eat the corpse. And sometimes they'll dismember the corpse in advance, like we see here, and they make sure that birds take it. So instead of being a burial culture, they are an exposure culture. At least in that regard. It's not the only kind of burial they practice, and it's something they themselves got from the Parsis, who are people in northern India. Parsis are descendants of Persians or Astrians who fled ancient Iran when Muslims took over, and so many of them moved into India and took their burial practices with them, and those burial practices traveled up into the Tibetan plateau in the 10th or the 11th century. And then Christian missionaries into Central Asia in the later Middle Ages became aware of this and passed knowledge of sky burial into medieval Europe, where they wrote about it a great deal and illustrated it frequently. And so it ends up eventually in the book of John Mandeville, because that work is extremely compendious in the kind of material it draws in. So I find this this illustration extremely fascinating just to look at, and maybe we can talk about that a bit in class tomorrow. The thing that's really striking to me, and I've written about this a bit in my second book, is how unjudgmental it is. It's just simply a description of the activity. And it says that the birds come and the birds know the custom, and they all come and they eat the flesh. And so it's as if the birds are fully part of the ritual. This is not like some simple thing where he's simply giving the bodies over to nature, but really about birds and humans all interacting together in this kind of complicated ritual. And so I think we can look at the Cynocephali in the way that Mandeville's kind of agnostic about whether or not they're human. He says they're reasonable. He's not super worried that they eat people. He thinks it's interesting, at least they eat their enemies. And here's a case where he's not very judgmental either. He's describing people who dismember their dead and then give them over to the birds to be eaten. And he finds it interesting, remarkable, as he's put it into the book, but he doesn't think of it as something to condemn. So now we can look once again at this bit with Didymus. And so here we have in Middle English, this is again not from Mandeville, but from a related story. The story is told many, many places, how Alexander sent answer to Didymus by letter is what that says in Middle English. And so here I have a translation again from the French original of Mandeville. Here's a translation into Middle English of that French original. Book of John Mandeville is translated into many, many languages from very, very early on. And so I can read a little bit about what Mandeville says about Didymus. I'll read it to you a little bit in Middle English just so you can hear what that sounds like. Although it hit be so that they have knocked all the articles of our faith, yet he trow that God love him nevertheless for her good purpose, and that they take her the same degree as he did of Joppa, that was a Paynim, the which he held him for his true servant, and many other. And he trow that God loveth all ilk that loveth him, and serveth him meekly and truly, and despedeth vainglory of the world, as these men did, and as Job did. And therefore our Lord saith thus, Ponum eis multiplicis legis meas, that's Latin, by the way. That is to say, ye shall put to him me laws manifold. And the Gospel saith thus, alias ovis habeo quod non sunt ex hoc ovili. That is to say, ye have other shape, they've been knocked of this fold. So to put that into modern English, you can read the translation here. You can pause the screen if you like. And basically it's saying that although Didymus of the Brahmins and also the Gymnosophi, the naked philosophers, is literally what that means, they are not Christian, and they are probably not even aware of the Bible in any way. So they're not Muslims or Jews either, but they practice everything that's important in terms of the Christian life, which is incidentally indistinguishable from the perfect philosophical life that we've seen described by Philo and Ibn Tufayl. So they are not attached to this world. They don't get attached to vainglory. They know that they are mortal, and they give themselves over to death and they know their limits as human beings. So it's interesting that Mandeville here doesn't say, and they need to be converted. So we don't have that kind of crusade mentality that we find in the King of Tars, or that we find in Saif Binti at San, that although these two other works are very medieval, they are kind of military fantasies of conquest and conversion. And Mandeville is a travel work, and it's much, much more about curiosity and encountering as many things as possible and seeing what's out there in the world. And it provides, I think, a very different picture of the Middle Ages than one we've encountered in the Saif Binti at San and the King of Tars, and to a certain degree different from what we encountered in the philosophical works, because it is much less judgmental. I mean, when you have the Cynocephali, who are literally part animal, being admired as reasonable creatures, we're no longer in the kind of world that simply says that certain humans are animal-like and therefore should be condemned, because even the dogheads are reasonable in Mandeville. So with all that in mind, we could say, what is Mandeville's answer to the question of what counts as human? Or we could probably answer that by saying it's the wrong question. It's something that Mandeville is not all that interested in. He's much more interested in multiplying possibilities. So to sum up, are the Cynocephali in Mandeville human? Or is that the wrong question? At any rate, they're reasonable. They're also anthropophages. They eat people. Is it okay to be eaten by animals? If it's a custom, sure. So they're not just abandoning their dead to the birds, they're enlisting them in a cultural activity. So it's no longer a binary between nature and culture. It's not simply a human versus animal situation there anymore. And maybe being human is about knowing your limits. That seems to be what Didymus is saying to Alexander. He says, you want to make yourself like a god. Well, that's silly because that's not what you are. You're a human being and you should know your limits. And we here who know that we're going to die, we know our limits. That's what the Didymus and the Brahmans and the naked philosophers say. So there are limits, however, to Mandeville's ecumenical attitude. And if we read this whole work, I would say that, interestingly enough, the people that Mandeville condemns are the Bedouins. They wander through the desert, and he doesn't really like people who wander. And he doesn't like the Jews either, because he is a 14th century Christian, or the person who wrote this or compiled this is a 14th century Christian, and they are extremely anti-Semitic. And it's possible, too, that he doesn't like the Jews because they, too, at least in his world, don't seem to have a clear place to belong. So there is a limit to how open-minded he is. And I think his open-mindedness has to do with how well he can put things in their place. And so maybe we can talk about that in more detail as well on Tuesday. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to our class.